And it is truly my privilege and honor to compare this important event under Petrotech 2016. Honorable Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan, Minister of State, Independent Charge, Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Government of India, Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO, Niti Aayog, Government of India, distinguished captains of the industry, India and abroad, esteemed guests and invitees. On behalf of Petrotech 2016, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to each one of you. It is my great honor to now invite our patron and chief, Honorable Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan, and chief guest for today's CEO Conclave to preside over today's function. I would request Mr. R.K. Mittal, Executive Director, Exploration and Production, Indian Oil Corporation and coordinator of today's CEO's Conclave to kindly escort him to the dais. I request the audience to welcome our chief guest with a big round of applause, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to now call upon our first panel speaker, a senior member of the Indian Administrative Service, Kerala Cadre 1980 batch. He is the author of Branding India, an incredible story, and has been a prime force behind the very successful campaigns Make in India, Startup India, Incredible India, and God's Own Country. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO, Niti Aayog, Government of India, to kindly take his seat on the dais. Thank you. May I now invite our next panel speaker, who has over 40 years of experience in entrepreneurship and business. Under his dynamic leadership, Vedanta Group has achieved tremendous growth, both organically and through value-generating merger and acquisitions. It is my pleasure to request Mr. Anil Agarwal, Group Chairman, Vedanta Resources PLC, United Kingdom, to kindly take his seat on the dais. Request a round of applause for Mr. Anil Agarwal, please. Thank you. Our next panel speaker is a highly respected authority on energy, international politics, and economics. He was conferred the Pulitzer Award for his book, The Prize, The Epic Quest for Oil, Money, and Power. As quoted by Times magazine, if there is one man whose opinion matters more than any global energy expertise, it's Dr. Daniel Howard Yargin. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together to invite our next panel speaker, Dr. Daniel Howard Yargin, Vice Chairman, IHS Markit, USA, to take his seat on the dais, please. Thank you, sir. It is now my privilege to call upon our next panelist, who has a vast international, technical and managerial experience, making him one of the most influential voices in hydrocarbon sector. He is Deputy Chairman and CEO, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation, Mr. Nizar Mohammed Al-Sani. Ladies and gentlemen, I request you to applaud and welcome Mr. Nizar Mohammed Al-Sani to take his seat on the dais, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to call upon our next panel speaker, who as head of Honeywell Electronic Materials has led the business into new markets, diversified the product portfolio, and drove new product development. Under her dynamic leadership, she has steered the business through an industry downturn, positioning it for a strong recovery. Please welcome Ms. Rebecca Liebert, President and CEO of Honeywell UOP USA. I request her to kindly take her seat on the dais. A big round of applause, please. Thank you. As head of the Indian Oil Corporation, the country's largest commercial enterprise, our next panel speaker is a strong votary of energy security for the nation and in making petroleum products both accessible and affordable. He is well known for his transformative leadership style, and under his leadership, Indian Oil is fast emerging as an integrated major. It is with great pleasure I would like to call upon Mr. B. Ashok, Chairman, Indian Oil Corporation Limited, to take his seat on the dais, please. Thank you, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to introduce the next panel speaker, and he is the moderator for today's session. He is a key analyst for Wood Mackenzie and is a domain expert in the sphere of commodities, global trends, and corporate analysis research. He has over 20 years of experience in oil, gas, utilities, and mining sector, and working with the boards of many energy companies on strategic issues. Please welcome Mr. Simon Flowers, Chairman Wood Mackenzie Limited. I request him to kindly take his seat on the dais. Mr. Simon Flowers, please. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, Petrotech 2016 has been a huge and remarkable human effort under the able guidance of Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Government of India. This evening's event is very important as it will set the tone for future deliberations during Petrotech 2016. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my privilege to request Chairman of the Organizing Committee, Petrotech 2016, and Director, Human Resources, Indian Oil, Mr. Verghese Cherian, to give his welcome address to the august presence. Do we have Mr. Cherian here yet?
Where's the best way?
Okay. Moving on, I would request Mr. Simon Flowers to kindly take on the proceedings for the event and invite our guest speakers, please. So you may take your time with the microphone. Thank you. Mr. Simon Flowers, please.
Excuse me. There's no initial speech then, is there?
Yeah, I think can we carry on?
Honourable Minister and dignitaries, CEOs, captains of industry, ladies and gentlemen, and last but not least, my fellow panellists, welcome. It's been a long day for everyone in this room, and I'm well aware we are between you and your dinner. So we shall try and make this session as fast and furious and interesting for you as we possibly can. I'd like to say a few words to set the scene. These are challenging times. Oil prices will average just $45 or so in 2016, the lowest in a dozen years in real terms. After last week's OPEC meeting, the outlook is a little bit brighter for 2017 than it might have been, though I'm sure you'll agree we're not out of the woods yet. But this is a cyclical downturn we're experiencing, and we've been through many before. We'll surely come out the other side sooner or later. What lies beyond in the longer term is a question I find I'm asked in many meetings around the world. New secular challenges have emerged for energy markets, and we have presented our view on those in our perspective for the CEO's Conclave, titled Hydrocarbons to Fuel the Future, Choices and Challenges. And you should each have a copy at your table, and I hope you enjoy reading it. We'll bring out the elements of these challenges over the next hour or so, and what I'd like to do is provide a framework for our discussions and focus on two of the broader aspects. First, the big picture. What sources of energy will fuel global economic growth in the longer term? Now, the very fact that a major conference like this is taking place a month after the ratification of Paris is testimony that the energy industry takes these challenges seriously. Energy consumption patterns are already changing and will continue to change, though there is much variation from region to region. Let's just look at three regions and how things have changed over the 4 decades from 2000 through to 2035. Now, we're using Wood Mackenzie forecasts here, so you may have your own different view. Let's start with the US. Now, we expect energy demand in the US will be flat over the 35-year period. And in percentage terms, fossil fuels contribution in the US will also be flat at about 83%. It's pretty high. 83% in 2035. And this is despite renewables making rapid inroads in many states. But in the US, carbon emissions will fall by almost 20%. And that's because energy supply shifts from coal to gas and becomes less greenhouse gas intensive. Secondly, Europe. Now, demand for energy in Europe will actually fall by 2035 in absolute terms, and carbon emissions drop by 25% over the period. And that's because strong policy is bringing about significant change. Wind and solar will eclipse fossil fuel as the main source of power in Europe by 2035. Thirdly, India. In this rapidly growing economy, as we heard a number of times this morning, energy demand will triple by 2035. We heard Prime Minister Modi this morning reiterate the Indian government's strong commitment to sustainability and renewables. But much of the increase in demand will have to be met by coal, which we think dominates growth through the next 2 or 3 decades. And in fact, India becomes the most important market for coal in Asia over that period. And so carbon emissions will rise 3-fold by our calculations. And the rest of the developing world also has huge potential for economic growth, but in all probability needs fossil fuels and coal in particular to make it work. Now, the world may remain too reliant on coal and other fossil fuels in the coming decades, and we need to find a better balance and solutions to fossil fuel dependency. Now, my second theme is, what is the oil and gas industry doing about all this? And I think the blunt answer is not very much, at least just yet. But as I mentioned already, having a conference like this indicates just how far up the agenda the challenge has risen in a relatively short period of time. Now, in one respect, the Paris Agreement could not have come at a worse time. Now, the year between COP21 in December 25 to the ratification in November 2016 coincided with these very low oil prices. And that's meant that the immediate focus of most energy-producing companies has been on dealing with severe financial pressures, surviving. And frankly, few have been in a position to adapt, and it will take time. Yet, adapt it must. Climate change policy and the advent of disruptive technologies like electric vehicles are perhaps the biggest existential threats to the oil and gas industry in the careers of us all in this room. We just don't quite know when that threat will materialize. So energy companies need to form strategies and adapt to this changing world. Most are only at the beginning of the process, but need to think hard how to reposition from the world we know, a relatively comfortable one, notwithstanding the last couple of years, to reposition and embrace new opportunities. Timing the change will be tricky, and another reason why strategies may take some time to come into play. Now, a number of major oil companies have made announcements in 2016 elevating the importance of new energy in their organizational structure. Some have existing legacy renewable investments. Others have begun to build new businesses around renewables. Certainly, the oil and gas industry needs to prepare for change. The biggest risk for companies is to do nothing and be left exposed to investors making their own minds up. It's a pleasure for me to be here as moderator with this distinguished group of panelists. Let me sit down with them and we can start a bit of a discussion. Thank you. So, one of the things that we touched on in a number of the discussion, but not really dwelt upon, is to do with the supply of oil. And there's been a lot of gloomy forecasting among the die-hard oil bulls that there is a huge supply tail out there which will keep us going for absolutely ages. And it was crystallized a few weeks ago in a discussion in London between Rex Tillerson of ExxonMobil and the Saudi oil minister, one believing that there might be a supply squeeze and the other one dismissing it. And I was very interested to know how some of our panel might view the forthcoming tightening or rebalancing of the market, and whether we might have plentiful supply going forward, or there might be a squeeze which might push prices up much higher from current levels of $50 plus per barrel. And Nizar, I wonder if I might start with you and see if you have a view on that.
I think if you look at it, Simon, there are three elements that decide this. One is technology. Secondly is regulations and the environmental impact. And thirdly is political stability. And if you take historically on, if you see the demand-supply side, when the Arab Spring started in 2011, we lost about 1.3 billion barrels a day from the Middle East. Libya, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, and partly the sanctions on Iran. And if it wasn't for the US shale, where it balanced the market, you would have seen prices escalated even higher than $100. But what you see today with the low price environment, a lot of the IOCs have delayed, canceled, or shelved a lot of projects in the range of $500 billion. That will definitely have an impact because our industry is capital intensive. It is a long-term industry whereby decisions we make today, you only see 5 to 7 years from now. So I think eventually, what Dan was alluded to earlier this morning, you have a growth of about 1 million barrels annually. You have a decline rate from the existing mature fields somewhere in the range of 6 to 10%. That compounds to, he says, 5 to 15 million barrels a day in 5 years, which is about 20 million. So you need a lot of investment to catch up with that. That investment we don't see today. There are only few people investing today, basically national oil companies in the Gulf region, some around the world, but very few investments. So eventually, I think within 3 to 4 years' time, even with the shale in the US and other parts of the world, I think there will be a squeeze and prices come 2020.
Dan, he mentioned your name in this. Would you like to pick up on that point? I'm sure you have a view.
Yeah, I think that this industry goes in cycles, and as Nizar said, that you have the scale of this cutback, we're going to see the impact of it. And I think that the debate that you cited, Rex Tillerson and Khalid Al-Fallah, was very interesting because Khalid's concern was that if you did have another spin up in price, that would be destabilizing once again for the oil industry and would damage the market again. Rex Tillerson was thinking that the U.S., this amazing Permian and so forth, would bring supply. He did say, and you mentioned that word too, a lot depends upon regulation as whether it can be produced. But just having looked at the cycles of this industry, I don't see any reasons that cycles have been abolished.
So it has been mentioned that tight oil, you mentioned that tight oil saved the price for going too high in 2014 when there was so much supply off the market. Does the US have confidence that Titanol has a lot further to go in terms of delivering supply? Because to the outside world, it's still very much an unknown factor.
Yes. I was just looking at some numbers in the famous Permian Basin, which is where the technology, a lot of this is happening in Texas and New Mexico. In 2000, it was thought that it had about 5 billion barrels left. Now it's about 60 billion barrels. So technology really matters. And I think we've seen an industry that's been resilient, that's been innovative, much more efficient than it was. And so much now is focused, we used to hear about the Eagle Ford and the Bakken, much is focused on the Permian. I think there is one question, what else is there aside from the Permian in these other areas? And that's still to be demonstrated. But, I think the productivity appears to be there.
Great. So that flows nicely into the import dependency, which was another of the subjects which came up this morning. And I had a quick look at some numbers, and India's consumption of oil is running about 4 million barrels per day, and production is a bit less than 1 million barrels per day, and that gap is only going to get bigger. So I want to start that on the production side. So some incentives have come in for upstream development and investment. And I wondered, Mr. Agarwal, if you might have some views about where Indian upstream might go as part of India's contribution to its own demand.
Very interesting. India, we import almost 80% of our oil, 85%. We in the cane produce 30% oil of the country, largest producer of oil in the country in the private sector. It's a tremendous opportunity for the upstream. If you see the exploration rate all over the world, is almost 90% been explored. India has already only explored 10%. So it's a I can share my experience of the upstream in India. This is the time we have been in the business last couple of years, and we have seen as the things are evolving, the government is simplifying the policies, revenue sharing models are coming, and if you see the new block which they have put on auction, is you hardly touch the government. You hardly touch the government, is almost run on its own. We as a cane, we are very committed to take this production going forward as a vision to have 500,000 barrel. We are looking in a medium term to produce 400,000 barrel, to invest $4 billion into the cane, which was the marginal field. So as an experience, whether it's a small marginal field or making partnership with the ONGC or for the new block or offshore and the onshore, this is the only place in the world which is a by and large developed and is a democratic country. And we had a conference in London, and I have encouraged that the kind of opportunity you will find in India, which has it is unexplored country, only 10% has been explored against other places which is a 90% been explored. If people can come in, it is a place. I can give you another example. We produce oil at $4.50. It is the lowest cost of oil producing in the world. 80% of our revenue goes to the government. So for the government of India is the biggest benefit to get the oil around $5 or $6 or $7. So it is the way things are opening up. My experience says that we are right on the fence. It is a place where offshore, onshore, I have seen, we talk about Permian field in US. Even if you see US, Trump has come and he has a 5 main agenda, and one of the agenda is about shale gas, and he's going to saying that I'm going to explore the energy security, and we have a similar situation. And today we have seen the way our Prime Minister has said about the opening up of Upstream. So I'm looking forward. I'm looking forward as far as the cane is concerned to produce 500,000 barrel, and on the oil field we have started producing commercial gas, and which we are supplying to the fertilizer company. So tremendous potential in Rajasthan. When the election was going on, our Prime Minister went to Rajasthan and says, this is the field which I want at least 50 companies in this region to come and explore and produce. So this is the kind of potential we have in India, and I thought I should share.
No, thanks very much. And just briefly to Mr. Ashok on continuing his upstream theme, because your company, mainly a refiner, but also has upstream interests. How do you view capturing upstream reserves, comparing India with your international expansion?
No, I mean, as you mentioned, we have been predominantly a downstream company operating refineries and midstream and pipelines and marketing networks. But we have got into upstream about 10 years back. Now the marginal fields which have come up have actually opened up an opportunity for companies like us. So to really get into upstream, try to become operators. And as Mr. Agarwal mentioned, the policy is now very open and it encourages people to get in without much of complexity. It's very simple to bid. So we have taken part in certain of the blocks which have been on offer, and hopefully we would get some decisions in our favor. And we think that certainly it is very encouraging going forward, and it will also help us to get into bigger blocks as and when they come up for offer.
Excellent, thanks. So I'd like to stay on this theme of import dependency and go back to the figures of Indian energy growth across oil, gas, and think about the challenge that lies ahead in planning and rolling out the infrastructure. And Mr. Khanna, we're really interested in your view. I think we'd love to hear how you're going to tackle this huge challenge of delivering the supplies that will arrive in India or you'll develop yourselves and getting them out to the consumer. Would you like to share a few thoughts with us?
Well, we are growing at about 7.6% per annum right now. India is an oasis of growth in the midst of a very, very barren economic landscape across the world. But the challenge for India really is to grow at 9 to 10%. That's the ambition and that's the hunger of this government. To grow at 9 to 10% per annum for 3 decades or more, year after year, year after year. And for you to be able to do this, you need to give a huge impetus to your manufacturing sector. You have a very young population. 72% of your population is very, very young. You need to create jobs for them. You can't do this without manufacturing. And when you do this, you need energy. Your dependence on energy is very, very high. And therefore, what India is going to witness is a huge focus on renewables. To my mind, the focus will be on sustainability. And it's important that India focuses on sustainability because the trend for urbanization is enormous. By 2050, India will see 700 million people getting into the process of urbanization. And that means that if India follows the model of the Western world, where urbanization was done for cars and not for people, so India can't afford that model. India needs a very sustainable model. If India was to follow the Western model, you need 4 planet Earth. But alas, there's only 1 planet Earth, and therefore the sustainability will be our focus. And therefore, to my mind, renewables, India has a very, very ambitious target on renewable side. There's a huge stress. We've given a huge commitment for climate change at Paris. Our Prime Minister is fully committed to it. But our Prime Minister is also committed to a very aggressive target of providing electricity to every single individual by 2022, every single household. That's a huge ambition. And therefore, energy becomes the key focus of it. And to my mind, India needs to lay a lot of stress on bringing in private sector into upstream. We've brought in some predictability. The Honorable Minister has brought in a lot of new possibility of private sector investment. But my view is that India needs to bring in a lot more predictability, consistency, and clarity of policies to allow private sector to come in, give them international prices, and allow them to sell and sell anywhere they feel like. You know, to my mind, the key for investment in the upstream sector is predictability, consistency, and clarity over a long-term period. Because this sector requires a huge amount of investment. We don't need one cairn. With one cairn, you can't survive. You need hundreds of cairns to come into India. And unless you don't provide that, that will never happen. And therefore, we need to push the envelope. If India's ambition is to grow at 9 to 10%, get every top producer into this country, allow them to get international prices, make them invest, and make them flourish here. It has to be a win-win for India. This is an opportunity. India can't afford to lose this opportunity.
Well,
and I think a series of policy measures have been taken by Minister which are on the right track towards that.
But probably won't get you there by 2022. I mean, some of these changes, you know, upstream planning cycles are long term. It might take you 10 or 15 years to invest and get the production out. So in the meantime, it's an import strategy that you have. But I think it's a very clear message, isn't it, there, that we've scratched the surface in terms of injecting investment into upstream, but a great deal more needs to come.
Much more needs to come, but the interim, my view is that India has a window on the coal side, which is a very short-term window, very limited period for probably the next 7-8 years. It has huge resources on coal, but it will have to invest enormously in terms of technology today on coal side. But it has a huge possibility on the renewable side. I mean, the target which the Prime Minister has put before this country is 175 gigawatt. And one of the good things that has happened is that competitive, transparent biddings have led to a sharp fall in solar prices in India. They've fallen very sharply in India. And therefore, we'll see a lot of more renewables. And we'll see a lot of more decentralized renewables. We'll see in India a trend where cities after cities, where houses will get supplied with solar gas through decentralized supplies. You will see manufacturing plants being supplied with solar supply. So you will see a lot of more focus on renewables. It has been possible because of the crash of prices on renewable side and because of the evolution of technology, India has been able to benefit from good solar.
So you think what I mapped out there, which is more of a traditional view of the future, that you'll develop much like a developed country, dependent on fossil fuels, could be wrong. You've got to do it maybe for the next 5 or 10 years, but there is a chance to break out from that cycle and create a different economy based on more sustainable energy, so long as you get the right signals from government and fiscal incentives.
Well, my belief is that more than fiscal incentive, and I'm a great believer in this, that more than fiscal incentive, you need to put your policy framework, which is extremely predictable and consistent and has clarity over a long-term period. This sector, you can't get long-term investments without that predictability and consistency. And I think this government seems to be putting that on track.
Well, you've made a very clear point. I'm also, though he may choose not to take it up, Minister, if you'd like to say a few words in response, we'd be delighted to hear it.
After forceful argument of Mr. Amitabh Khan, there's nothing left. But I would like to little bit extend that argument. We know our limitation, we know our market. This government is focused to develop an India model. We can't copy any country's model because we have a typical society. Multi-billionaire there, and somebody is flying in the. Mr. Agarwal is Indian origin person. He is roaming around world with his jet, and in his home state in Bihar, half of the population is yet to get clean cooking fuel. This is a reality of Indian market. I have to welcome and accept the new reality with Mr. Agarwal, and I have to accept the challenge in the hinterland of my country. This is my challenge. So I have to develop, and we have to develop our own model. And my Prime Minister is very focused on 2-3 things. When he is talking about reduction of import dependency, that doesn't mean we will not import anything. That doesn't mean we will not import, we will not have bilateral relationship. Recently, we have invested heavily on Russian market. We have invested more than 5 billion worth of investment. We have done in the producing field in Russia. We are there, our investments, Mr. Ashok's investment is far away, Gorgon to Vancouver. We have our overseas investment. But to augment our domestic production, that is the easiest way. Lot of things are interrelated to that augmenting of our production. Lot of local job creation will be there. As a vibrant economy, our responsibility is there. How to create more jobs. How do we create more jobs? When our domestic economy will be on. Augmenting our oil production is one of the strategy. And not only augmenting oil production, to create a business-friendly energy market. My Prime Minister has a two-pronged strategy. What is our aim? Energy justice, energy for all. By 2022, we have to provide electricity, we have to provide clean cooking fuel, we have to give affordable transportation network, we have to create more jobs. To create more jobs, we need energy. So energy is a centrifugal point of all our economic activities. Simultaneously, how do we achieve that? Through minimum government and maximum governance. Investment has one precondition. It needs clarity. It needs certainty of investment. And we believe if we go by market policy, if we create the level playing field, government will not interfere in the day-to-day business. Government will be limited its role up to policy framework. Then investor will come. I can share one bright example. Our friend Dan is there. Since last few years, he is actively participating in our policy framework. We are taking some of his tips to how do we go ahead. My Prime Minister has recognized in one thing in hydrocarbon, this is an international commodity. We cannot think in isolation. We have to look into the international development of hydrocarbon economics. So we have to align ourselves in that standard. Recently, we are very open on certain things. We have de-bottleneck in so many areas. And we have very focused. We have to augment our production. We have to have our international bilateral good relations. We have to energy security by our overseas investment. And we have to create our own refining capacity. We have to create our own petrochemical capacity. We have to create our own marketing network. Recently, we have given license, given permission to company like BP in our downstream market. Recently, I think Mr. Ashok has quoted in the small discovered field. When the price was around $40, in those days we went to market. When the OPEC was not decided anything, before that our bid came, they were small, they are very small, but 5 overseas companies are now participated in our market. Lot of new players are participated in this bidding round, and company like downstream company like Mr. Ashok's, they have participated in the bidding round with a $40 marketing price regime. So I am hopeful with the policy certainty, we will be march ahead and we are confident.
Well, I think you've just summarised how complex the task is ahead, but also a clear strategy that the government has to dealing with that. So thank you very much for that contribution. Now you took you mentioned 2 words that we haven't touched on before, which is refining and petrochemicals. So I'd just like to start with Mr. Ashok and come to Rebecca here. A huge amount of refining capacity has to come in here. We heard this morning of multiple fold growth in aviation fuel. I mean, we tend to think about gasoline, but aviation fuel is going to grow hugely. Can you shed some light about how the refining industry is going to meet that demand? It's nearly 200,000 barrels per day through next decade per annum of capacity needs added next decade. Is the capital available? How is that going to pan out?
See, at the turn of this millennium, actually India was importing a lot of products, and it was decided at that point when the first task of decontrol of the industry started. I mean, private players also came in, and the refinery business has grown multifold from that time. And India has consciously taken a stand that we will become a refining hub. I mean, for us it is going to be difficult to import products to cater to the volume requirement in the country. So certainly we are focused more on creating a refining hub. The second thing which we did is we based our refineries on the ability to process multiple crudes from different parts of the world. So we don't design refineries today based on a single source of crude and all that, which gives us much greater flexibility in terms of our processing ability. So all the new refineries which have come up in the country have the capability, I mean, they are very high on complexity index, and they can process different types of crudes from various parts of the world and so on. And we have created that. So we have been having capacities ahead of the demand. We have been creating capacities ahead of the demand, but now our demand is catching up. And our refining capacities, maybe if we don't expand, in fact, the most recent refinery that we had commissioned was during the current year, in the month of February, when it was dedicated to the nation, 300,000 barrels per day capacity refinery in Paradeep. But going forward, we do recognize that the demand is going to shoot up substantially, and we want to stay as a refining hub in this part of the world. And we have tremendous competencies in our refining capabilities, in our technology, I mean, our manpower. We also have a lot of technology ourselves. I mean, while organizations like UOP have been doing business with us for decades, but today we also have a lot of in-house capability in terms of refining technology. So we would continue to do that. So we are looking at all sorts of brownfield expansions which are possible within the existing refining setup, and we are also talking of large greenfield projects which could come up. The only point which we are cautious about is that in case there is a disruption, I mean, what do we do? So we are trying to build in the flexibilities in the refineries that we are setting up, which can cater to any sort of change in demand. And going forward, it is not going to be refineries for refineries' sake alone. It is going to be integrated refining and petrochemical complex, because we do believe that even in petrochemicals, the growth opportunities in this country are huge.
Thank you. Now, Rebecca, if I can turn it to you and pick up what Mr. Ashok said about partnerships, and you're a partner with Indian refiners here, and part of your expertise and what you bring to the party is the integrated package with petrochemicals and the technological expertise. As you've looked to the next decade or two and what India has to do with its refining and chemicals industry, what do you see, and how do you think UOP and the refining industry has to adapt to meet the changing needs of consumers?
Well, I think Ashok hit on several things. I mean, we're always asked, obviously, to deliver solutions that bring the highest returns to our customers. And that's becoming more and more complex because we want flexibility. We want to be able to process multiple crudes, which oftentimes means more units, so your CapEx can go up. You also want to be able to make clean fuels or have highly integrated complexes, which can also drive CapEx and costs up. But in the same time, you want efficiency. So then you need the integration. You need heat integration, hydrogen integration, maximum value from the bottoms of the barrel, or the full molecule management, as we like to call it. So it's becoming ever more complex to deliver that advanced refinery petrochemical complex at really strong returns. So that's where I think you have to keep advancing the technology. And and look to the future on how you can get the most out of every molecule that comes into the refinery and that goes out of the refinery. And big data, IIoT, right, the Industrial Internet of Things, we believe is really going to be an enabler for that in the future, because with the data that's available now and with incorporating that with process models and machine learning, we can be more forward-looking on how we're optimizing and driving reliability at the plants. So instead of upsets happening and recovering from upsets, we're out to prevent those upsets. So, you're going to see more of what we call a Honeywell connected plant, where your plant is connected really throughout everything, connected plants, connected workers, connected environments, because you can now, with the low cost of sensors, measure everything. And we truly believe that that's the future of refining and petrochemicals. It's going to be the pure process technology and driving everything that we have done for the last 100 years since the first refining patent in 1914, but also taking it to the next phase with the Industrial Internet of Things.
And India, as we look into next decade, India is going to have multiple new refineries, so it's going to be at the leading edge. It's going to be refining a lot of product it's bought in and reselling it out into the outside world, and have one of the most up-to-date fleets around the world. Would you see it that way?
Absolutely. I think India is at a great place right now to build these new complexes because, the technology's advanced to a point where everything can be incorporated now, and when you do it, from the beginning, you can really drive those economies of scale. So.
Great. Now I've got one more question, but we could talk all night about this one. Because we're going to talk about adapting to a low-carbon world and some of the issues around that. And after I've asked it, if we've got time left, I'm going to throw it open to the floor. So if you do have a question for this esteemed group of panelists, I'd love to hear it. But before we dive deeply into carbon, where I'm going to engage everybody on the panel, we're very fortunate because we have one person here who has a hotline to Mr. Trump. Because, Dan will describe exactly what his position is, but I know, Dan, you've been invited to join his team. And I think the audience would very much like to hear your initial thoughts you might have about a U.S. energy policy under a Trump administration.
Right. So on Friday, I found that I was appointed to, it's called Presidential Strategy and Policy Forum of President Trump. And it's composed mostly of CEOs like General Motors, IBM, JP Morgan, Disney, and I guess I'm supposed to be the voice of the energy industry on that panel. But that still doesn't mean we don't have our first meeting until February, so I don't have a hotline yet, but I can sort of point out some outlines. And they do contrast with Hillary Clinton. There were actually two Hillary Clintons running for president. There's Hillary Clinton, who was moving to the left to deal with Bernie Sanders, and then there's the Hillary Clinton who you read her emails, and she was much more practical and realistic. But Donald Trump very much set himself against the Hillary Clinton, who was running officially in the campaign. And first thing, of course, to keep in mind that a lot of oil and gas activity in the United States is regulated by the states, not the federal government. But we've seen the federal government increasing its push. I think there are a couple of areas where there will be an immediate effect. There was a strong effort to regulate methane as a greenhouse gas, quite controversial with the industry, because the industry said it's actually not a problem or one we can manage, and it would put a lot of oil wells actually out of business, uneconomic. So I think that's not going to happen. The other issue that's a very big issue in the United States is public lands. Might sound, public lands, how much is that? In the western United States, the federal government owns 47% of all the land. And so what happens there is very important, and I think strong movement there about opening up. Clearly there'll be an emphasis on domestic oil and gas production, less emphasis on renewables, but a lot of the incentives and subsidies that are there, I think, are likely to remain. It raises some questions about the degree of support for electric cars, because one of the things is the more we look at it, the more we see the question of what the automobile fleet is a great deal has to do not only with what Apple and Google does, but also with what governments do and really around the world. And Donald Trump has made clear that he doesn't share the same view of the Obama administration on climate change. During the campaign, he described climate change as a hoax created by the Chinese. Since then, he's kind of backed off from that, but it's pretty clear that his administration is not going to have the same emphasis on climate, whereas if you saw, this interview that was done a few months ago with Barack Obama, he thought it was the most important issue that he was dealing with climate change. And so I think there we'll see some impact, and it's ironic not only after Paris, but after the signing a year later of all the countries coming on board. So I think that's an area where we'll see a lot of friction.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I'm going to ask each of the companies here to outline just some thoughts about how they would position for a low carbon world. And it might mean that you don't go into renewables. It might just mean that you have a particular niche strategy in upstream, for example. But I'd like to start with Mr. Agarwal. How do you envisage Vedanta positioning for a low carbon world on a, say, a 10-year view?
No, we are fully committed. When our Prime Minister in Paris has committed that what should be the carbon position, and we are part of it. And we are all going out for renewable energy to balance, because we have a thermal plant, we have oil and gas, and we are balancing, and we are fully committed. And we want to have a pace with the international position, whereby we can match the international norms by 2025, 2022 to match the norms.
Thank you. And Nizar, perhaps I can turn to you next. Do you worry about renewables disrupting you? Do you worry about EVs? Do you focus on being a low-cost producer? What are your thoughts for Kuwait?
For Kuwait, we are focused to be a low-cost producer. That goes without saying. So we're working very hard on our cost structure, on our cost per barrel, on our unit cost, and trying to manage our cost expectations. These are mature fields. There's enormous water cuts. There's sulfur content increasing, but we're trying to do that. We're not worried about renewables, because the growth in renewable will be minimal and will not take part of the overall energy demand seen as we see it. To go back, what are we doing to be a low-carbon society in Kuwait? We are importing LNG since 2009. As a country that produces 3 million, we still do import LNG in lieu of liquid fuels that we fire in our power plants. His Highness the Emir has mandated that 15% of all energy demand in Kuwait by 2030 should be renewable. We are in KBC and subsidiaries are working to do that in 2020. So there's enormous effort to work on renewable energy within Kuwait, part of the energy picture. Having said that, fossil fuels will be the domain. Crude and gas will be the domain of the energy supply.
And Rebecca, as a technology company involved in refining and petrochemicals, what do you bring to the party on carbon?
Yes. So I think we think about it in two ways. One is, how do we use more carbon efficient fuels to get to petrochemicals? That's a big need for this environment. So we have methane to petrochemicals. We have ethane and propylene, PDH, and MTO technologies to go straight into the petrochemicals route. On top of that, we have a full slate of renewable technologies, rapid thermal pyrolysis to take woody biomass into fuel oils, and the capability to then to co-process them in refineries, as well as convert them into green jet, green diesel. So we're heavily invested in both technologies from sort of gas and LPGs into petrochemicals, as well as renewables.
Great. Now I did offer the audience a chance to ask a question. Is there anybody who has a burning question they'd like to ask us? If so, do raise your hand. We'll give you 15 seconds to think it. Yeah, thank you. Back in the back there.
Hi, good evening. My name is Subramanian Sharma. I'm the CEO of L&T Hydrocarbon. I think there's been a lot of discussion on growth, India's economic growth and the demand and the supply gap. But I would like to know from any of the panel members, is there enough focus on conservation of energy? I know our consumption per capita is low compared to the world, but still whatever we consume, I think because of various problems we have, the efficiency, our conservation can be improved. So I think that by itself will help us overcoming this challenge of supply-demand gap.
If I call it right, is there enough focus on conservation and efficiency? Was that the thrust?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Who would like to answer that? Mr.
The Honorable Minister?
No,
I'll answer. Okay.
I can supplement.
No, certainly I think we have been focused on conservation, and we believe that even in terms of the Prime Minister's directive of reducing the import by 10%, there is a substantial component of conservation built into that. I mean, I'm probably happy to share, most of you are oil industry people, you'll know that we started our conservation efforts right in the mid-70s, with the first oil shock. And we have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of petroleum conservation, research association and activities, related activities. And whether you talk of the refineries per se, where there's a lot of focus on how to improve the energy efficiency, to having more fuel efficient automobiles on the roads. I mean, once you get into the Euro 6 and with the latest generation of vehicles, obviously ads like Kitna Deta Hai is definitely a part of the psyche of conservation. And there are a lot of efforts in terms of energy efficiency ratings and energy efficient appliances being used and so on. And I can take the example of even the LED lights. I mean, which is the numbers that we used to have a couple of years back and what we produce currently on a daily basis, probably it has beaten the annual targets on a daily basis. So there are a lot of efforts. We still can do a lot more, but certainly conservation is forming up a great part in terms of reduction of our dependence on oil.
I'd like to supplement my dear friend also. In our whole strategy of reduction of 10% import dependency, conservation is one among the key component. LED is one clear strategy. Another clear strategy is first time in India, we're using LNG as a automotive fuels. Recently our auto industry recognized this fuel as a automotive fuel. This will be cheaper, this will be cleaner, as an alternative fuel. This is an effective strategy we are adopting to use LNG as a automotive fuels that will help us to conserve the whole energy resource.
Simon, let me add a supplement to the supplement. When I first went to teach at the Harvard Business School, actually the subject area I worked on was energy conservation. And one of the things that always struck me about energy conservation is that it's largely invisible. It's very hard to get a photo opportunity. You can have a great photo opportunity of a windmill, but how do you take a photograph of conservation? But you look at how much more efficient countries have become and the whole new wave of technology, including all the sensors that you talked about. And just to note, Mr. Ashok talked about automobiles. By 2020, 80% of the new cars sold in the world will be sold under fuel efficiency standards. That is conservation.
Thanks. And I agree. Oh, sorry, please, Mr. Kant.
You see, a vast number of measures on conservation have been taken. But we must understand that India's energy demand is going to rise. And it's going to rise because India's economy is going to grow and expand. And, our process of urbanization has just begun. The process of urbanization has ended across America. It's ended across Europe. It's nearing its completion in China. And India will do more urbanization in the next 5 decades than what it has done in the last 5,000 years. So your energy demand is going to grow. Conservation is a little minuscule part of it. The challenge is, to my mind, that as our demand grows, we do a kind of urbanization which is extremely innovative and sustainable in nature and create a model for the rest of the world. You know, Americans, when they created their cities, they created cities like Atlanta where 98.9% of the people use cars. Everybody uses a car. They created cities for cars and not for people. The challenge for India is that we don't repeat the mistake which Americans have already made. And we create a model which is extremely innovative and sustainable and then can be replicated by other countries of the world. And that's the only way to make India a sustainable country.
Great. It was a great question. Thank you very much. Now we're going to move on and I think close the panel session. Mr. Ashok, are you going to say a few words? Are you expecting to say a few words now? We're going to move on. Well, in that case, I'll draw a panel session to a close. But I think, Honourable Minister, I'd like to invite you to say a few words if I've got the programme right. Are you expecting that? Are you expecting to say a few words?
No. My only appeal to this CEO conclave will be, India is, today morning we have positioned ourselves. India is not only a market, India is something beyond that. Please have faith on my Prime Minister and our policy. Please come to India and invest your resource and you will get good returns. That is my sincere appeal to all my CEO friends.
Well, if you just bear with me for a second. The good news is we finished bang on time, even though we started about 15 minutes early. I hope you've enjoyed this session where we've talked about the global supply picture, the challenge for India securing its supply, the opportunity within India to stimulate more investment, to reduce import dependency. An amazing story for those of us who know the country less well than perhaps most of you in this audience, of this complex problem of meeting the economic needs and this incredible growth that this country is looking forward to the next few years. I was also very much struck by the sort of commercial angle of economic growth and urbanization with the point the Minister made both this morning and in this session of the need to deliver electricity and cooking gas to the hinterland. You don't want the Indian rural communities depopulated, and I think that's absolutely tantamount to India being a success in the coming years. We learned a bit about the refiners and the challenge for meeting the enormous capacity that has to go in, but also an opportunity for refiners to do well there. And then lastly, we had a very interesting debate about the future, really, and conservation was part of that, the US policy and how Mr. Trump's administration will react, and really good insights from each of our panelists on how their companies would meet the low-carbon challenge. So as the very last thing, I'd like you to thank, please, our panelists for their contribution to this. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you all very much. And are you going to...
Ladies and gentlemen, I would request a huge round of applause for Mr. Simon Flowers for giving us an enticing session this evening. I would request distinguished speakers to kindly take their seats on the dais for now. Please be seated, please. Thank you. I would request the audience to kindly seat as well. Thank you. Tonight's event has been very enriching, and I'm profoundly thankful to each one of you for being so supportive and attentive. It's really inspiring to see every person here committed to address global energy concerns, to help keep the oil and gas industry reinvent itself to cater to the new energy markets. Before the formal closure of the session, it is time to honor the key contributors to the CEO Conclave with mementos. It is with great respect I request Honorable Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan to present mementos to all the esteemed speakers. I would request Honorable Minister, Sir Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan to kindly present a memento to Mr. Amitabh Kant, CEO, Niti Aayog of India. Next in line, I would request Sir to kindly present a memento to Mr. Anil Agarwal, Group Chairman, Vedanta Resources PLC, United Kingdom. Dr. Daniel Howard Yajin, Vice Chairman, IHS Markit, USA. Can we continue with a round of applause, please, audience? Mr. Nazir Mohammad Al-Atsani, Deputy Chairman and CEO, Kuwait Petroleum Corporation. Thank you, sir. Dr. Rebecca Liebert, President and CEO, Honeywell UOP, USA. Mr. B. Ashok, Chairman, Steering Committee, Petrotech 2016 and Chairman, Indian Oil Corporation Limited, please. That was a very nice gesture. Last but not the least, Mr. Simon Flowers, Chairman, Wood Mackenzie Limited. Thank you, Honorable Minister, sir, for doing your honors. Now, may I request all our esteemed panel speakers to remain on stage for a group photo. It will be a great keepsake and memory of this truly stimulating conclave. Thank you, sir. On a final note and without much further ado, I would request all our distinguished guests and dignitaries to please join us for a cultural program at Darbar Hall. It will be followed by dinner at Mumtaz Mahal Hall. Wish you a pleasant and wonderful evening ahead. Thank you so much.